Hey there, trans dudes. I am here with Frankie this time, talking about a book that you, Frankie, chose by Bell Hooks called Feminism Is for Everybody. So I first just wanted to ask you, why did you choose the book? Why were you interested in this one?
I was interested because I haven't read any bell hooks before, and I really wanted to be convinced that feminism is for males and for men and inclusive of men.
I'm looking forward to talking about that. Were you convinced?
Um, no. No, I wasn't. Got some fascinating points, that's for sure. I took a lot of notes. Um, there was parts of the book I really enjoyed. There was other parts that I was like, I don't agree with this at all.
Well, before we get into a deep dive into actually the content of the book, we're not going to do this one chapter by chapter like we did with when we did Dworkin's Women Hating, just because there are 19 chapters. It's a short book, but she packs a lot in, and there are 19 chapters. We're not going to get through all 19 chapters. But before we do that, there are some bigger concepts I wanted to look at first. So one is, um, I know that you didn't read Women Hating with us. That was the last book that we talked about, which I talked about with Oliver. Um, but I think you have read some Dworkin in the past. Am I right?
Yes.
Even though
Yeah.
that you haven't read that book, but I wanted to ask you just, and I know that you're not prepared for this, so there's no right or wrong answer, but thinking about when you've read Dworkin and now
Mhm.
you've read Bell Hooks, what impressions did you kind of get from the differences between how they approach things?
I have a feeling they've argued with each other. I have a very strong feeling these two women have met.
What do you think
Reading.
they might have argued about?
Um, I definitely think that they argued about like lesbian feminism. I definitely think they argued about sex with men for sure. Speaking of, Bell Hooks like interpretation of motherhood and the home and domestic life, I could tell that Bell Hooks was a straight woman and would have loved to be a mother in the home, whereas Dworkin wanted full women's liberation and full freedom from man and wanted to envision a world where we didn't have men at all, didn't have to rely on them for anything.
Yeah. It was interesting that you chose this book right after Dworkin, just because they're almost polar opposites in a lot of ways. They're both feminists, but their books are very different, and there's a few reasons that I can speak to briefly about some of those major differences. So one is, I mean, Dworkin, she is laser sharp, right? I mean, she's on like this razor edge of, it's like she's trying to accomplish something very specific, and the way she writes is very, very focused, very sharp and focused. Bell Hooks is not as sharp and focused. Um, but there's some differences in how they're approaching things. And, because I know a lot of the trans men that are listening to us aren't necessarily familiar with feminism and feminist concepts. One of the points I want to make off the top is that there isn't a single feminism. There are a lot of different branches, there are a lot of different voices and thinkers and disagreements within feminism. Dworkin is a radical feminist, and very unapologetically so. So she's very focused on women's oppression and systems of oppression. So radical feminism is looking at sex hierarchies. So radical doesn't mean extreme, it means looking at the roots of oppression. And they see roots as material structures. So ways in which our society are organized that produces women's insubordination over and over and over again. And so a sexed hierarchy between men and women. Um, Bell Hooks is not a radical feminist, so she does use words radical and critical in this book. And this is the first time I've read this book, by the way, but I have read other books she's written. But I did pick up she used the word radical and critical, and I want to explain what those things mean. Um, so I just explained what radical is in really brief terms. Critical is different. So critical is also interested in looking at systems of oppression, but they do it in a very different way. They do it by looking at discourse, which is like bodies of meaning making. We make sense of the world through language. And so they are focused very much on looking at how we create meaning in society and how those meanings have a relationship with power and trying to dismantle power by dismantling those, through changing discourse. They can be complementary. So in Dworkin's last book, she talked a lot about storytelling. She opened the book by talking about fairy tales and how even as young children, we're learning these scripts of what it means to be a girl or a woman in society in relation to men. And those stories tend to reinforce a hierarchy. So we could apply a critical lens to that, saying, well, those stories are a way in which patriarchy, the meaning of patriarchy is one of the ways that it persists and one of the ways that we learn it. But bell hooks, um, I would say, is probably more in the tradition of critical feminism. And the reason I say that is because she describes herself as a black feminist. So she's using what's now called intersectionality of looking at multiple layers of oppression. So I think that's why her book gets so convoluted at times. She's trying to build in not just women's oppression, but she's also building in racism and classism and other types of oppression. Um, And another detail, she doesn't talk about this in the book, but she is also very influenced by Buddhism, which a lot of feminists are. Alice Walker is another example of a feminist who embraces Buddhism. I did for many years. Largely, I think, because for those of us that do value spirituality, Buddhism is a less patriarchal type of spirituality. But she talks a lot in this book and is more so in others about relational ethics and prioritizing love within those ethics, which I think is largely coming from her Buddhist interests. So she's weaving all these things together in ways that she's not always explaining, but I wanted to just start by explaining some of that. So where bell hooks, I mean, this was a short book, but she packed a lot into it. And she's weaving all these different ideas together. So it's less sharp than what Dworkin was doing. Dworkin cuts right to the chase. She knows exactly what she's trying to accomplish. It's all centered on women. The criticisms of that approach is it didn't always allow for a lot of nuance for the ways in which Black women experience womanhood differently than white women do. And it raises questions about, this is a big debate in feminism, is when do we prioritize women's liberation versus prioritizing other forms of oppression? And I'm not I'm not Black, so I'm not going to speak to that angle, but I mean we see this in gay and lesbian politics too, where sometimes lesbians feel caught in the middle between addressing homophobia, in which they're forming allyship with gay men in order to address homophobia, and then that's not centering women. And what a lot of lesbian feminists have found in the gay and lesbian liberation movement was that the men tend to dominate all those spaces. So it becomes a tension when we're trying to do too much at once, is to figure out when does one thing take the priority more than other things. So for a Black woman, she may feel conflicted between when do I prioritize women? When is this a woman's issue versus when is this a racism issue in which I need comrades among, Black women and Black men? So I wanted to just say that off the top before we got into some of the material, because I think that those multi layers is why bell hooks become so fuzzy, and I sometimes find that frustrating.
Yeah, she does become a little fuzzy. I mean, 19 chapters is quite a few.
Yeah, yeah. So what? I mean, like I said, we're not going to go through chapter by chapter, but I am going to touch on some of the chapters. But what stood out for you about this book?
So, yeah, I wanted to say that I do think this is a great book that I would recommend to, like, if a man, a coworker man was like, "Hey, what's up with feminism?" I would hand them this book. I think this might be a good way to maybe introduce people to feminism because she does address men's issues and she very head on addresses the feminist stereotype. Um, Later, though, I start to question her own lesbophobia, which she very much asserts she is not lesbophobic. However, I'm sure she's straight. Please correct me if I'm wrong.
I actually
Um,
don't know.
oh yeah, it seems to be such. It seems like she's talking about her relation to men. Um, yeah, I mean overall, like I I think it would be a good starting point, but I definitely feel like it's not where I'm at in feminism personally, which
Yeah.
is why I really like your angle of like when do you prioritize certain pieces of yourself, like as a transmasculine person, it's like when do we prioritize female rights? Because our rights are completely contingent on the feminist movement as transmasculine people. Like, she talks about in the book birth control, abortion, the free love movement. Things like that are still relevant to this day.
Mhm. I agree. As I was going through it, I saw in a lot of the chapters relevance to trans men, and those it's kind of where I want us to focus as we're reading through this. She's writing for a general audience. I mean, she's named this Feminism is for everybody. I think if I try to imagine who is she writing to as an imagined audience for this, I think she really did mean everybody. Like I think she imagined that some men would be reading this, right, as well as some women. Dworkin, I think, is writing for women.
Yes. Yeah, I think so. Like if I were to try to convince a man about feminism, I would not hand him Dworkin. I would hand him bell hooks for sure.
Yeah.
Um, she does try to appeal to men, and I dislike the way that she does blame women, some feminists, for men having a distaste for feminism. Um, she specifically brings up, um, the issue of white feminism, right? And how a lot of leftist men want men to lead and leftist women to follow. How we see even like within our own liberation movements that sexism is just it permeates every aspect of society, including other types of liberation movements. And I think that's relevant to the transgender conversation. The males subordinate the females.
Yeah. Yeah. It does raise a question. So she defines, I do like her definition of what feminism is. It's very clear, so she defines it as ending sexism and dominance,
Yeah.
which kind of covers it. But um, so I think part of what she's trying to do by defining it that way is repeatedly through the book, she's saying, well, sexism isn't just men being sexist towards women, that women can also be sexist towards themselves and other women. And I do think she has a point there that the when we're looking at this problem of women's oppression from a radical feminist point of view, it's not about pointing at individuals, saying individual men are the problem. It's looking at a whole system in which our society functions through patterns and habits and routines that have consistently prioritized men, and we all kind of learn how to live within those systems. And I do think we internalize a lot of that. So I do think some of the work of feminism is always looking at, the inside job, not just the outside job. So I do think women replicate aspects of patriarchy in how they treat one another or how they secure power for themselves, sometimes by replicating male behavior. And in some ways, we do that too. And that's been one of the criticisms for a long time in feminism of butch lesbians is they feel like, well, we're just even without taking testosterone as we did, saying butch lesbians are just trying to mimic men. I don't agree with that criticism, but these are questions that have been within feminism and a lot of divisions within feminism for a long time.
Yeah, she brought up in her book a criticism of butch femme. She didn't call it butch femme, but
Yeah.
she said lesbians replicate the patriarchy and not all lesbians are feminist.
Yeah.
And that kind of I'm like, I don't really like this part. I wasn't a fan because I don't feel like as a butch that I'm replicating the patriarchy. With the woman I'm currently seeing, I beg her, I'm like, please, please, please don't treat me like a straight man. I will never act like a
Mhm.
straight man. And I don't like that expectation upon our relationship. Um, I think butches and could have really feminist relationships with women.
Yeah.
And I don't like her definition because what about uplifting women? It's to the definition of feminism is to end sexism, but what about uplifting women?
Yeah.
It doesn't, it needs to be more woman and female specific. um
Yeah.
I know what she's trying to do by including men. She wants their power, she wants them to support it. um So that's what I mean by like it's a good starting point, maybe to kind of plant the seeds in people's heads. But it's hard for me to fully agree with her definition of what feminism is.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean the feminist criticisms of butches and the butch femme relationships in particular has been, well, you're replicating heterosexual patriarchal arrangements in your relationships. And one of the reasons I don't agree with that is it certainly hasn't been the case in my relationship history, and it hasn't been for a lot of the relationships that I've witnessed, is the butches weren't dominant in those relationships. I mean, they tended to be either more egalitarian, or oftentimes the femmes were the dominant ones in the relationships. So it oftentimes reversed that power dynamic.
And I just don't believe that in any way a woman completely defying the patriarchal grooming that women must be mothers and wives is patriarchal. I just can't. I believe it just can't be fundamentally. Um, my my grandmother overheard me listening to this earlier, and it was really funny because it was talking about marriage, and she was like, "Well, that's just the way men are." And I was like, Jesus Christ, I told her God did not put me on this earth to be a mother or a wife. And she she very quickly was like, oh well, that's okay too, I support lesbians. And I was like, well, I don't think fundamentally, yeah, I just fundamentally don't think any form of a lesbian relationship can be patriarchal.
Yeah. I agree
Um,
and I disagree with that. I mean, I do think because we live within a system, I think we all, I think it's impossible to live outside of it. Like I think we all internalize it in different ways, and when we can do that work to try to kind of pick it out of our brains and not participate in it. But I think it requires constant effort and an evolution of learning and consciousness to start to recognize how you're how you're living that in your day to day. But I think lesbians by our nature, because we're not oriented around relationships with men, it's perhaps easier for us to see that and to not and to sweep that out of our lives.
yeah, yeah, no, everyone needs to do the continuous work. I would agree with that. Um, I'm checking my notes here because I had something on the topic. Oh, yeah, she brings up the man-hating stereotype to discredit feminism, and she talks about the appeal to homophobia for anti-feminism.
Mhm.
Um, and I was just thinking about, heterosexism, which is a word she mentions in the book. And the way she also mentions that straight women will subordinate lesbians.
Yeah.
Um, I kind of think that straight women project um, their own trauma onto lesbian relationships in some type of ways. They see a butch femme and they make these assumptions about this relationship. Just like for me in relationships with bisexual women, they've been very sexist, heterosexist towards me in the past. I'm sure you might be able to relate of women treating you like oh, your sex drive isn't high enough. Oh, why aren't you making so much money as a man would to spend on me and things like that.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, so I've definitely had women replicate patriarchy towards me. I think more so than the other way around.
Well, you've mentioned before that, like because you're the mask in a relationship, that when you take a woman out on a date, the waiter or waitress usually gives the bill to us,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So there are all of those little things that, yeah, but it's impossible to live our day-to-day lives without confronting aspects of patriarchy all the time. And it is assumed because we're masculine that we're assuming a male role in every aspect of our lives, which usually isn't the case. But I do see a lot of trans men trying to do that.
Yeah.
They sort of
Yeah.
become stereotypes, extreme stereotypes of men. It's almost like little man syndrome. You know how
Yeah.
short men tend to try to overcompensate by driving muscle trucks, and I think
Mm.
trans men sometimes do that too, that they try to perform an extreme male stereotype to overcompensate for feeling insecure.
Yeah. I could see that. I could also see, maybe in my age group, a push to become a trans man for a lot of younger butches. Like I felt that way because it just felt, I don't want to say easier than being a lesbian, but there was like, you know, there is social reward to behaving masculinely. And there's also social reward within the queer community to being the most queer person in the room, whatever that means.
Yeah, I could see that.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the ways I think that Hooks was trying to appeal to a broader audience, I think she did that in a couple of ways. One is she was almost overly nice. about everything, like really emphasizing a warm and fuzzy feel for feminism, but she also made some really interesting choices. So, for example, in the, what section was that? Ending violence. So that was chapter 11. Usually, when feminists talk about violence, they're talking about violence inflicted onto women, usually by men. I thought it was interesting that about 95% of that chapter was dedicated to women's violence against children.
Yeah.
So it's almost like she's trying to appeal to a male audience by saying, look how awful women are too. That women also do bad things. And so it just frustrated me because she was just, I think she was just trying to accomplish too much and speak to too many people and kept flip-flopping back and forth between, sort of reassuring men, no, it's not that we think you're awful. Women are awful too. Like it just, yeah, I didn't find it to be a very satisfying book. She did make some good points though, here and there, but I thought overall the book frustrated me.
Yeah, I also got frustrated in that part because we just know it's disproportionately men who rape, who abuse children, who abuse women, who commit femicide. We just know it's disproportionately males.
Yeah.
So
I just thought it
her,
was an interesting choice to only focus. I mean, I don't object, I guess. It's not that I want the opposite to be true, that we paint women as you can't ever do anything wrong and it's all men that are doing everything wrong, because that's not true either. But I think she kind of drifted too far in the other direction. She could have balanced chapters like that out more by talking both about the violence women experience and the ways that some women are violent. So I just thought it was an interesting choice that she dedicated the entire chapter to women's violence. That seemed a bit bizarre to me. And she seems to want to call all bad human behavior patriarchy, as if patriarchy is the only reason that anyone ever behaves badly.
yeah. Yeah, that chapter I wasn't a fan of either. Um, I mean, you're right. She like it was also her just cramming too much in. Like, oh, now we're talking about children's liberation. Now we're talking there's just a lot of different liberation fronts going on here. And I mean, I had an abusive mother, and I was like, you're right, that does happen. However, what are we talking about again?
Yeah. I think one of the ways she could have approached that, to look at it from an actual sort of patriarchy framework, would be one of the patterns that happens is that when women have been abused by those in power, usually men, that that can have a trickle down effect. So, I mean, it's been documented that when women are being abused by their husbands, they sometimes take that out on their kids, right? So they're insubordinate to the men and children insubordinate to the women. And so that mistreatment can trickle down. I think that might have been a better analysis of how that functions than just saying women can abuse children.
Yeah, I know. And then she also kind of made a jab at single mothers a little bit, and that kind of bothered me too. At least I interpreted it that way. She did assure us that single mothers are not the problem, but it's the patriarchy that the single mothers are teaching their sons that's the problem. And I didn't really, I just, I wasn't a fan. I was like, why are we blaming single mothers for their sons growing up to be terrible?
Yeah. I mean, she did say that one of the reasons that happens is if if parents, because parents are the authority over the children, so there is a power dynamic there inevitably, that if parents abuse that power, either through, well, various forms of coercion and dominance and abuse, that children learn to equate power with abuse. And so that can teach boys to grow up to be powerful and then abuse that power. But to blame the mother entirely on that, because she wasn't talking about just parents, she was talking about mothers.
Yeah. Yeah, that was questionable. There was some other, I have another note here that I thought was questionable when we're ready to move on to the next
Sure. Go
topic.
for it.
Oh, yeah. She said that the men's liberation movement was correct in identifying sexism as the issue. And then she goes on to negatively talk about lesbian feminists who imagine their lives completely free of men. And she talks about how some women have deep bonds with sexist men. And I was just like, what was the point? There's many things that made me say, what's the point of saying this?
There were a lot of those moments in here, yeah, where I kind of scratched my head. It's like, what are you getting at here, and why was that your angle? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I agree. I agree. And she didn't in the lesbianism chapter. She mentioned that she's been criticized of being homophobic in the past, and I almost felt like this chapter she was almost trying to overcompensate and say, "No, I'm going to dedicate a whole chapter to lesbians to prove I'm not lesbophobic." But her whole chapter seemed to center around this idea of not lesbian sexuality, but the role of lesbians within political activism. So she talked about not all lesbians are feminists, which is true. Not all lesbians would call themselves feminists, but lesbianism in itself tends to get overemphasized as it's an identity or it's a political choice. She doesn't name political lesbianism, but that's really what she was talking about is women who call themselves lesbians not because they actually are attracted to and want to form loving romantic bonds with women. It's that they hate men and therefore call themselves lesbians as a way of rejecting men, which is very that I political lesbianism has driven me nuts right from day one. Like it's not because I feel like it was one of the first infiltrations into lesbianism for political reasons. Like I did not choose lesbianism for political reasons. I don't feel like I had a choice in the matter. I've always been oriented to being attracted to women. So she spent a lot of time in that chapter talking about lesbianism as a political choice.
Yeah. Yeah. And when she mentioned that, she also mentioned a sex worker who had a lot of sex with men, but insisted she was a lesbian. And I was like, wow, the discourse has been the same for 30 years.
Yeah, I've
But
known quite a few lesbians that were strippers and stuff.
yeah,
That's not
yeah,
me.
not to, I was just, I just thought it was very interesting how some of the same um conversations. I mean, for me, I I've met some bisexual women who are political lesbians, and I personally, as someone who does have lesbian relationships, I don't know if I want to be with a woman who is a political lesbian. I don't know if I would want to be with a woman who doesn't truly love my body and the feminine parts of me instead of just hating men.
Yeah, that's always sat wrong with me too. Um, let's go back to the top of the book. We're jumping around a lot, but I'm gonna just really briefly, we don't have to talk about every chapter, but just so that listeners can kind of get a sense of what this book was about, I'm just going to mention each of the chapters. So she starts off talking about feminist politics in general, which is where she defined that feminism is ending sexism and dominance. The second chapter was consciousness raising, in which she talked about how in the early days of feminism, it was very much a grassroots movement. It was a lot of um, women coming together in groups, and so those early, I attended some of those early. I mean, I'm not old enough to have been a feminist in the 60s and 70s, but even in the 90s, there were still consciousness raising groups where women get together and organize at a grassroots level. And she's right that a lot of those groups, it was a lot of venting. It was a lot of women that just needed to express their hurt and rage. And I think for healing that was important, but I do think that's part of what maybe gave feminism a bad name is if that's all the public sees is women venting their rage. Um, it does shape a public perception, and it's hard to balance that. Like I mean, there were a lot of consciousness raising groups where women got together to talk about sexual violence, for example, and so they would, give them a mic and have them talk publicly about being raped, and that's important. But one of the dangers of that politic is it can trap women in that trauma too. When all you're doing is when you feel like being a feminist is about always being angry, always talking about your trauma, I think it can prevent women from moving through that trauma. But she talked about how feminism, when women's studies programs started in the university, that feminism kind of shifted to being more of an academic discipline. And certain women went to universities to start developing feminist theory, um, which kind of left a lot of women behind, that not every woman has access or even wants to go to university or become academics and write books. And so there was a shift where feminism became too academic. It was no longer really accessible to just the average everyday woman, and working class women felt more and more excluded from the movement. Feminism started to become something, a means that certain women could build their careers, which was largely, upper class white women. So I did like that chapter, because it was just a bit of a history lesson and how feminism has changed a lot over the decades. I think we're starting to see more grassroots feminism. Um, but I'll talk about that more in one of the later chapters. The next chapter is about sisterhood and some of the pros and cons of all women's groups. And she mentioned going to an all women's university versus going to a mixed sex university and some of those differences.
Yeah,
Uh,
I thought that was profound, because I live near Stanford University. Um, and I she really drives home what female socialization is and what it feels like.
yeah,
Even when she makes all these excuses for men inflicting patriarchy, she still insists that female socialization is real.
yeah,
Um, and in the way that she began to doubt herself, just the way that women are quieter, make themselves more appeasing, more docile in the presence of men. I personally face discrimination because I'm not a super docile, hyper passive woman. If I don't like something, I say so.
yeah,
And at work all the time, I say, do this, fix this, that's wrong. So men don't get along with me. They're not used to women giving them direct commands. Um, so that, that part really spoke to me as, still to today, there we have the female socialization of I'm female, so I'm expected to act a certain way, and it makes me doubt myself. I've doubted my capability. I've doubted my experience. I've doubted my intelligence just because of the men around me think that they're better than me by virtue of their body parts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There are advantages and disadvantages to same-sex spaces. I do think it's important that women have them.
Mhm.
Um, but there are disadvantages too. And so what she was talking about, just the dynamics in the university, she's right that it's something I saw in my first undergraduate degree in the 90s was in fine art. So it was mixed sex. And I was part of a group of feminist students there. And one of the things that we were talking about is because there were a lot of group discussions in those classes, and it did tend to be the men that were always dominating those discussions. And one of the things we talked about is what's the solution to that? I mean, is it that men need to back off and talk less, or is it that women need to learn how to speak up? It's both.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it's both. Men are domineering everywhere and I can't stand it. Um it it's a give and take. Yeah, it's back to the question of we can't blame men for everything. Um it's lately I've been thinking about, I'm like, male attracted women, why do you act this way? Why do you make yourself smaller to appease men? I don't get it. But they do. And like with bell hooks, I didn't understand her a lot in talking about having deep emotional connections with sexist men, patriarchal men. Why would she do that? Because they like men. What? Why? So yeah.
I've heard that from a lot of straight women when they're hearing, especially lesbian feminists talk. It's like, do you not understand that some of us actually really do like men and really enjoy sex with men? But it's not something I can relate to, but yeah, but I've heard that a lot from from straight women. I was going to say something else about, well, yeah, just about all women's spaces. I mean, I don't want to paint all women's spaces as always warm and fuzzy and wonderful either. I mean, I work, and maybe that's partly because I have been a butch lesbian for many years. Before I took testosterone, I was still very masculine. Butches don't always fit very well in some women's only spaces. Women can be pretty awful to butches. But I've also worked in nursing for 17 years, which is mostly female spaces. It's a well-known fact in healthcare management when you're working with units that are almost all female, some of the cattiness that can be built into the culture of those units, like women can be really awful to one another and are she mentions this point later in the book that boys and men are taught from an early age to have each other's backs and to form teams. I know men do compete with each other in some ways, but it's true that they're socialized into a kind of like the old boys club that men have each other's backs. They're encouraged to play sports. They're encouraged to, I mean, whether it's military service, sports, fraternities and universities, they're taught you have, I hate the term, but when they say things like bros before hoes, like they mean it, right? And
Yeah.
women aren't socialized that way. Women are socialized to compete for male attention, to resent one another. If you're, we talked about this when we are talking about women hating last time with Oliver, was women tend to envy women that are more attractive than they are. And so I don't know how we get that right, that I do think sisterhood is an important concept. We get absolutely nowhere in any political movement unless we can, form bonds with one another and work with one another. But I've seen it time in practice, I've just seen it time and time again. There's always been such vicious infighting and, groups form and then they fall apart. And everything from lesbian baseball leagues to feminist organizing. It's a hurdle women have to get over and undo some of that their socialization in order to stop fighting all the time and competing with one another and forming these really toxic pecking orders where women want to control the whole thing. And so she talks about some of the class dynamics in that. So she, chapter 7, mentioned that class was the first major divide in feminism, that the working class women really resented the upper class women, who it was always the upper class women that wrote the books and got the platform, got the attention, got mainstream media attention, and the working class women kind of felt left behind. And they felt that patriarchy affected them even more so than it affects upper class women. So that I think she's right that that was the first major divide. I mean, what have your observations been in all female groups?
Mm, well, it's hard to say because I've always been gender nonconforming. So I've, always
So
felt
speak from that perspective. What is it like being a gender nonconforming woman in women's space?
I often feel unwelcomed. I mean, it depends on the space. In certain spaces, I totally understand and respect women's right to be wary around masculine looking people. Sometimes it just feels lesbophobic, however. Um, or I've been using women's spaces again because I just feel safer doing so, truly. And it's like, why should I have to put myself in harm's way to make more feminine, pretty women feel better about themselves? Um, or feel comfortable or whatever, because I know I'm not a threat. Um, so it's just kind of, yeah, I've always felt othered by women, and being a, I don't know, a less conventionally attractive woman. I get it's I guess, yeah, there's, I would say pretty privilege is a thing. I see that more pretty feminine women get rewarded um in a lot of aspects of life. I think maybe except specifically the places we work. Um, because at my workplace and a lot of blue collar workplaces, if a woman shows up with the full face of makeup, they don't respect her as much as a worker. They're like, why'd you put on makeup before work? It's being blue collar is the one place where I get to wear men's clothing and no makeup, and it's cool. Um, but that's not all women's space now, is it? It's
Yeah.
with other women. Do I feel like I have to like, they judge each other's makeup, they judge each other's hair, they judge each other's clothes. And that is also part of classism, right? Judging other women's clothing, that's classist. I feel like the way I present my style of androgyny is seen as low class, grubby, dirty, um, because women are supposed to wear like tight little shorts or whatever.
Yeah.
And because I want to wear baggy loose shorts, I'm dirty now. I don't know. It's odd.
Yeah.
So yeah, other women treat me like I'm out of fashion. A little weird, the ugly duckling.
I think for women, it's a damned if you do and it's a damned if you don't. I mean, if you are the pretty woman, as you said, if you show up to work with, a nice skirt and makeup and your hair done, it they face their own kind of problems, I think. Like a really pretty woman is maybe not seen as intelligent, or they face a lot of resentment from women who don't feel as pretty as they do. So I think feminine women kind of get their own dose of shit, and we get it in a different way, right? It's that we often feel excluded or picked on because we're not the pretty women.
Yeah, that's why I'm really liking the term heterosexism lately for like specifically what we face. I saw it pop up in her book, and I'm like, good. Like, I want to see that word used more. um, it's, yeah, I feel like people are specifically sexist to me because I don't appeal to straight society.
Mhm.
I don't fit into straight society. And I did try to overcompensate for that at a time in my life, like a lot of, like you brought up, small guy syndrome. Tried to be a really binary trans guy, and that's a thing that happens. It's an overcompensation thing. um yeah, and you're right, it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. How do you feel about the term pretty privilege?
I don't think I've ever heard it before, but yeah, I think it exists. I think there's a lot of pressure to conform to sex stereotypes. And if you do, there are advantages, right? You are rewarded for conforming to those stereotypes and punished if you don't conform to those stereotypes.
Yeah, yeah. I know I often fantasize about, I wish I could have just been a normal woman so bad. And sometimes I'm like, wow, I'm soul crushingly sad that I couldn't, had just been a normal woman, meaning makeup, long hair, nails, whatever that is, whatever average girl my age is supposed to be, right? And I think, God, my life would just be so much easier. I would have a boyfriend who could take me places and buy me dinner, and I could have the approval of my family coming to my wedding, and they'd be so happy if I was just a mother. And they are rewarded in society in so many ways. Being a childless woman is frowned upon. And as a lesbian, that's not something I really planned on doing, was to have a child. I know some lesbians do. Um, but it's just, there's so many ways that the woman who fits into patriarchy is rewarded. So yeah,
Do you think there's
and
a
they do
cost
fix
to
it on.
them too? Do you think they're only rewarded, or do you think that there's also a cost?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Like, it's definitely damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah.
Because she mentions in the book how the working class women thought that the women at home were lucky to have a leisurely life at home, but the women at home thought that liberation meant joining the workforce. And that was probably my favorite part of the book, was her discussions of women in the home versus women in the workforce, and the types of feminism that they're doing and how those are different. um, Same thing could be applied to masculine and feminine women. There's positives and negatives to both, right? I'm sure some straight women see me as free because I don't have to, have sex with a husband once a week, or whatever. And I think, oh, it must be so easy to be a straight woman because a husband would take care of you, right? So either way, women aren't winning.
Exactly. And yeah, I agree with that because and no matter where we're situated as women, I think it's easy to kind of point to the other women. That's sort of that grass is greener effect, that you've got it better.
Mhm.
So yeah, I mean, from the outside looking in, you kind of look at the pretty women. It's like, well, you have the option of marrying the rich man because you're beautiful, and now you have this class privilege, and he buys you whatever you want, and you get to live in a nice house, and blah 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 blah, right? But they may also experience that as a kind of slavery,
Right.
right? And I think Hooks in one of the chapters, I don't remember which one, does kind of point to that marriage can be a form of slavery for women because yes, but for when you're on the outside of that, it can look like privilege. It's like, yeah, well, I'm not pretty, so I don't have the option of living in the nice house and having someone take care of me and protect me and blah blah blah. But I think the point of feminism is to dismantle that system so that we have options, right? That a woman can still have the nice house and financial independence and um lost my train of thought, that it shouldn't be an either or, right? That there shouldn't be privileges, just where there shouldn't be a reward system for women to be beautiful at the expense of all else, and women who don't fit the stereotype shouldn't be punished for that. But I think there is a danger always to kind of point at each other saying you've got it better, because that's one of the things I disagreed with Monique Wittick's work when she talks about lesbians existing, when she said lesbians aren't women, that we exist outside of those patriarchal confines. She said that's a problem lesbians don't have. And I would argue, well, it is kind of a problem when you don't have meaning and you don't fit within a social structure. Like, so,
Yeah.
it's easy to just assume that it can look like privilege from the outside, but it doesn't always feel like privilege when you're experiencing it.
Yeah, definitely. When, like, I personally used to be of the belief that being a housewife was the easy route, because I do labor. Um, and then, when she mentions in the book that housewives are generally isolated and therefore depressed and lonely, um, it's you're right. It's the grass is always greener, and we can do that with masc versus femme. And at the end of the day, there just shouldn't be the system in the first place that pits us against each other.
Yeah.
And I think that could be tied into the cattiness of women's only spaces. Why are we pitted against each other? Oh, the pretty one versus the masc one versus the fat one versus the skinny one versus the poor one versus all these different ways, the housewife versus the working class. Why are we always, women of all types are constantly pitted against each other,
Yeah.
and we're all losing.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. We're all losing. That's the point. But it's all a matter of perspective too. I mean, I learned from an early age, if I'm not the pretty girl, I can't sit around waiting for some man to come and rescue me and make my life better and to provide for me. Like, that just wasn't an option. I mean, I knew from an early age that I was a lesbian. So I knew if that's not my route, then I need a plan B, right? So I learned how to provide for myself and became career focused and went to university, and that was my strategy. So I mean, is that a disadvantage or is that a type of liberation? It's all a matter of perspective, right?
Right, right. I'm just thinking about my grandmother again. She had her first kid when she was 17, and just looking at her life with her husband and how that was, and her reaction to bell hooks was so funny because she was just either saying no, 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 or that's just the way men are and that's how it's supposed to be. And I was just blown away because she's never been to college. She's also never worked a day in her life. She's never had a job. I don't even think she's finished high school. And she feels fine. She doesn't question liberation, women's liberation, the way I do. And it kind of made me pause for a second. I guess she doesn't have to worry about how I make 73 cents to a man's dollar. For me, that's a pressing issue. I'm constantly doing my male coworker's job for him.
Yeah.
So, um, it's, so I wonder from her position, does she think I'm privileged? That was just where my mind was going with
Yeah.
that.
But I
Um,
think it speaks to, that what you're saying is that women are always in competition with one another. Women often default to tearing each other down rather than building each other up. And that becomes a challenge to this thing called the feminist sisterhood. It's 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 effective, right? I mean, if you teach women to always be in competition with one another, to always be fighting and tearing each other down, then that limits what we can accomplish. together. I mean, that seems by design to me, and it doesn't seem like it's just that women by their nature are argumentative and can't get along. I think that's taught into us. We're not, it's taught out of us, and we're not actively taught how to work in groups. I think, encouraging women, encouraging girls to get involved in sports, for example, is one great way of building that into girls to learn how to work together. So I think women's sport is really important. And one of the reasons why I think women's sport needs to be protected for women, because it is one of those places where women have and girls have the opportunity to learn how to function as units. That's very much a part of, um, the importance of challenging patriarchy is learning how to work together and not always relying on men for everything.
Yeah. Yeah, I wish all women, even straight women, like the way you and I have, would become not reliant on men. I've been thinking a lot about just pondering decentering men in my life. Um, and that's something I'd like more women to do, decentering men. But yeah, women's sports are so important. I mean, for me growing up, like as you were talking, I was thinking, I always had this idea they're only going to allow one girl on the team, and it's got to be me. With certain things, if it was co-ed, or let's say it was being in a band, I was like, they're only going to allow one girl in the band, and it's going to be me. Or other things like that. If there was like a science club I wanted to be in, or whatever, they're only going to allow one girl in. So who's it going to be? And that kind of competitiveness amongst women, I think, is like prevalent in so many spaces.
Yeah. She made a comment, Hooks made a comment in chapter 9, Women and Work, that the working class women were criticizing the upper class women, saying, in the quote was, women who work are already liberated. Now, of course, any working woman or a woman that goes to university would very much disagree, because as soon as you go into those environments, you're treated as lesser than, you're treated as stupid, you're talked over, you're not the ones being chosen for promotions, right? So it doesn't end with economic security, but it certainly helps to have economic security, because if you don't have options, if you don't have financial independence, you're trapped, and you don't have the option of leaving harmful situations. So it's a really important step to women's liberation, but it certainly doesn't end there.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. Like I just talked about a lot, women's being working class doesn't make me a liberated woman by any means. I still have to deal with so much in the workplace.
Yeah.
Uh,
She talked about sexuality. I wanted to touch on that chapter a little bit. I mean, she described that for women, there are really only two main archetypes. You're either a virgin or you're a whore. But one of the things that came to mind in that chapter was just because I want to try to bring this back to trans men's experience and make it relevant to trans men. I've noticed how often trans men are sexually exploited. I wanted to ask if you had any thoughts about why that might be.
I think it's because they try and be more like men in a way, maybe. Um, of, well, I'm like trying to think of the best way to phrase this. Men, when she talks about the free love movement in the book, she talks about how it mostly benefited men. Um, and I think trans men who are male attracted get sexually abused a lot because they feel as though they must keep up with men, um, and will put themselves in more risky situations with men But I mean, for me personally, that wasn't the case. For me personally, from my own experience, I felt like just being in proximity to men made me more vulnerable to men, um, because other women protected me less from men. It's like, oh, you're mask, you got it. And even, the parents who were supposed to be watching me and protecting me didn't prevent me from hanging out with boys, being alone with boys. Um, and that's when bad things happened to me. I was sexually abused when I was alone with older boys. Um, so, I feel like there's so many factors in why trans men face the sexual abuse that we do. um I mean, intimate partner violence, of course, is a factor there. Just like we talked about, it's disproportionately males. So in the male attracted trans men, I'm going to talk about it a little differently than ones like us.
Yeah, it does seem to be primarily the ones that are attracted to men. Hmm. They they're often preyed upon by men. And I know that there are a lot of straight male chasers that go onto gay dating sites pretending to be gay men in order to pick up the trans men. And they don't think of that they don't think of the trans men as men. They're straight men who I think are attracted to the vulnerability of a trans man.
A low hanging fruit type thing, perhaps, because they see them as, well, yeah, ugly, failed women. What are we but undesirable, unfeminine, failed women? Um, I could see that. I mean, I know a lot of them have some type of lesbian conversion fetish. Like, from my experience with sex work, that's what it often was. Um, there's men who genuinely just fetishize tomboys, and they're also predatory often. Um, there's so many types of men who prey upon transmasculine people, but yeah, it's normally based in some type of sexism or lesbophobia.
Yeah. Yeah, the way that Dworkin theorized sexual assault, so she saw it as she really emphasized the sexual nature of sexual assault that is an extension of what we would call normal heterosexual sex. That if normal heterosexual intercourse is a power dynamic, then I mean, by that logic, the difference between sexual assault and just normal heterosexual sex would be consent. That if all men are eroticizing power, sexual assault just becomes an extension of that. But I think the way she theorizes that, I think really fits what trans men experience. That there are like these men. I think it is about the power. They see the trans men as, yeah, you're just a vulnerable, broken woman who I can prey upon. But it there's a continuum of that to, but we're on a dating site. You agreed to up with me. You agreed to go on a date and you agreed to have sex with me. But it's still kind of a underlying that is still a predatory intent because what they're attracted to is the vulnerability. They're attracted to that power dynamic. So there is a continuum from that to trans men being sexually assaulted with the dividing line being consent. But when someone is highly vulnerable and they're being coerced, um, if they're economically marginalized, like there's a lot of reasons for why people are easily coerced. And I would argue that that's not really consent then if it's coercive. I mean, we wouldn't necessarily call it rape, but it's still coercive control, and that control and dominance is what a lot of men are attracted to. And so I think that has something to do with why so many trans men are exploited.
Mm, yeah, especially if they have the idea already that trans men are are already traumatized, right? A lot of
Yeah,
people assume that if you're a trans masculine, you've already been sexually assaulted.
yeah,
Um, and I think they might have that assumption and be looking for victims, knowing that it's easier to sexually assault somebody if they've already been assaulted,
yeah. Because
because they
yeah,
could
because the
freeze up.
nature of sexual abuse or assault is that when your boundaries have been violated, especially if they've been violated repeatedly or in, childhood by caregivers, they don't develop strong sense of boundaries for themselves. And when you then enter into adulthood without those boundaries, it's very easy for people to push them, and it just continues the coercion.
Yeah.
Men are
And
good. Men are good at spotting them.
yeah, yeah. And I mean, I think it's also like there's the particularly gross type of fetishist who knows if they validate the trans man, they can get easy coochie. If,
Yeah,
oh, yeah, I'll pretend to be a gay guy. If I call you the right pronouns, you'll sleep with me, right? Um, type of
exactly.
thing.
Yeah,
But it's also, I mean, for me in my specific experience, there's always been a flavor of corrective rape,
yeah,
of they want what they can't have. And it's about the power of I'm gonna fuck the dyke. I'm gonna be the one who's gonna stick my dick in the dyke and make you not a lesbian anymore. And they want that power so bad. Because when I was in the sex industry, that's what I got paid for. That's what would sell, dyke conversion specifically. So that type of fetishist is a very real guy, as well as the one who the validation guy
yeah,
who's fetishizing tomboys and knows it's low hanging fruit. There's a few types of guys here.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. But there are patterns, right? When you've been around trans men enough and watch their lives and watch who they date, and you can definitely see patterns.
yeah, yeah,
Thank God I'm not attracted to men.
yeah, yeah.
Huh.
I've been so much better since I've put the sex industry behind me and I've just not seen men.
That's
Um,
good. I wonder how we can get more out, but let's put a pause on that conversation. There's just one more chapter I wanted to cover, and then we should probably start to wrap up. But the chapter on love, I thought was interesting. um, because I knew a little bit about Hook's background already, and I know that she's written an entire book about love. Um, and she's coming at that largely from Buddhism and the relational ethics of Buddhism, but she's building that into feminism. But there is an argument within feminism about the nature of love. And so one is along the lines of that love itself is a construct in which entraps women into these relationships with men. That when you create this idea of romantic love and that's what you're supposed to be chasing, and that is one of the mechanisms that makes women dependent on men, which is a very bleak. uh I get the point. Like, I think when love is packaged within this sort of like fairy tale romantic narrative, that the whole point of being a woman is to be pretty and to grow up and to fall in love and to marry the prince and live happily ever after. So I mean, I get aspects of that critique. I do like, just to maybe end bell hooks on a positive note, because there's lots about here that we didn't like. But chapter 17 is about building an ethic of love back into feminism, and kind of saving the idea of love and human bonding. So she's not thinking of it in terms of that fairy tale romantic love, but what is love other than that romantic fairy tale? How would you respond to that?
Mm, that's a good question. I I mean, I'm not the type of person where I chase love like it's my sole purpose in life. Like I know a lot of women, it is. Their entire purpose in life was, like you said, wife and mother. That's it. Um, and I know that a lot of women feel like if they don't have a boyfriend, that they're not valuable. Um, like I know a lot of even lesbians who feel like if they don't have a partner, they're less valuable. Like they need that type of validation. So, I mean, love, gosh, I might have a more like, I don't know. My view of love, right, is already a little bit feminist, right? It's not something that you have, it's an action that you do. Like for me, that when I love someone, that means I want to spend time with them, I want to cook for them, I want to be intimate with them, bond with them. Um, and when I fall in love, it's generally with someone who I can see a lot of myself in. Um, yeah, what is love is such a like I don't know how to answer
Yeah, no,
that.
it's a hard question. So I was, yeah, I definitely wasn't looking for a specific answer. I kind of threw that at you, but I can see the point that it does because feminism, especially radical feminism, is always looking about structures, right? So structure meaning like what is the kind of system in place that kind of keeps all of this running and it's a system that always seems to privilege men. I can see how love functions that way in some respects. I'm not gonna go too far into, you know, being jaded and saying, well, I'm never gonna love anybody because that's just not it's just not in my nature. But so I like the balance that she strikes here because I come from more of a like a when I was a young adult, I left Christianity behind and became a Buddhist for many, many years. So I kind of get what I see what she's getting at here, and it's something I value. Like to think about what is love and human bonding that isn't a structure and isn't a trap. But there's an illustration I want to use, not about love specifically, but in this case, it was a we had met to talk about Canada's Truth and Reconciliation with Indigenous people. And the facilitators wanted to illustrate the harm that was done to First Nations people by taking the children out of the home. So the way that they did that is they selected, like 5 people and said, okay, you stand at the center of the room and you're the children. And then they selected, maybe double that number. You're the adults, and I want you to form a ring around those children. And then they had everyone else form a bigger circle around that. So you're all the other relations. You're the cousins and the grandparents and the aunts and uncles and the community. And so all these rings of people holding hands. So that represented the societal structure for Indigenous people. And then they had people come in and they kind of broke into those circles, all through all of those rings of the circles, and they took the children by the hand and led them all out of that circle. So that represented children being taken from their communities and families and put into residential schools.
Mhm.
And it was such a powerful illustration of how an entire system, an entire culture was devastated because it all centered around caring for children. And when you come in and you remove those children, the whole structure collapses. So we have to be careful when we disrupt structures. I mean, movements like feminism or aspects of the gay lesbian movement, it is about dismantling structures in which we are oppressed. We have to be really careful how we do that. but it really illustrate to me that yes, patriarchy is like that. It is a structure, that it has patterns. It's a way in which society functions. And that's the whole point of feminism, is to look at in what ways is it functioning that disadvantages people. Feminism being how is it disadvantaging women? So I can see how love, and it's something that I experienced in my life, because most of my adult life I've been in long-term relationships raising children together. So a fairly heterosexual kind of family unit system. And when that got ripped away from me, it was disorienting. It's like, but my whole life has been focused around loving my wife and loving the kids. And that was a system and a daily routine. It's how I organized my life. And losing that, I think, was hard, but it has had me reevaluate, how else can I structure my life and still be meaningful? Because I mean, conceptually, I understand. Like, it's not like every woman, or not like every person needs to be married and have kids and have that heterosexual kind of life in order to be happy. I've always known that, but at the same time, I that is how I structured my life, and it. So her chapter really got me thinking about that. Just the ways in which my life has been organized around love, which gave it structure, but in what ways was that also its own kind of prison? That was long-winded, but
I
that's
know.
when she was talking about love and how love is related to patriarchy. That's where my mind went. That it can be a trap if we feel like chasing love is the only thing that gives life meaning.
Yeah, I can see it being a trap. Um, I've been fighting codependency for some time now. And I've been trying to find ways that have my life have meaning outside of love, outside of a relationship, and being truly happy alone with myself. And that's been like immensely empowering, just to be able to know, be entirely self-sufficient, including not needing a partner to feel loved or validated. um I've spent time focused on my community. I've been like putting time into developing really strong, healthy friendships with other gay women. And it's been feeling more fulfilling than a romantic relationship.
It's good.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, like I think that really speaks to the truth of sisterhood. Um, I have a bunch of homegirls in a group chat who, and I know I could call upon them if something happened.
Yeah.
So yeah,
It's good.
um, I think it's love in a different way. The way I love them is different from a romantic relationship. And sometimes I question, is it wrong to love in different ways? Should I not love my partner in the way that I love my friends in my group chat?
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. It was an adjustment for me, because like I said, my whole life was all about like meeting with the kids, teachers, and helping them with their homework. And my whole life was organized around that. So it was sort of the empty nesters system all of a sudden, or empty nest phase of my life earlier than expected, I guess. But I am finding a sort of sense of freedom in that now. I mean, going back to university has really helped with that I'm focused on building other things. My life is becoming organized around school and building my career, and what can I can contribute and in other ways, and forming bonds with the other students, my colleagues. And so it's getting easier, but Yeah, just that chapter, I would say out of this whole book, that chapter resonated with me personally the most, I think. I wouldn't be able to do this master's degree if and then I want to pursue my PhD. I mean, I wouldn't be able to do that if I was still married with kids, I don't think. I think that would have been because they needed me a lot. They demanded a lot of me. So it's yeah, it has been a different kind of freedom.
Yeah, I'm glad that you've found freedom in it. Liberation, freedom could mean so many things. Um, uh, Something that's makes me feel better about being childless and kind of familyless. Um, I don't even remember who said this quote, but they said something like straight people have children. Straight people will leave their legacy will be their children. But gay people, our legacy will be our art. And your art, it could be your writing, your political movement, whatever outlet that is what you're going to leave behind. And that's just like what makes me feel better about being childless and sterilized, is knowing that when I'm gone, I won't have a little me, but I'll have a huge body of, work that I've done.
Yeah,
Yeah.
good. Any last things you wanted to touch on from your notes before we wrap up?
Checking my notes. I think we covered it. Um, Going to the bottom here. Mm, no, I got to criticize her little bit of lesbophobia that I picked up on, that she really insists she does not participate in. She is
She
not
was trying
lesbophobic.
so hard. She was trying, you could tell she was trying so hard. I do like, I will say, as much as we've been picking apart this book, I do really like Bell Hooks as a woman. I did attend, I don't remember exactly what year it was, but I did attend a public lecture by her. She's a very good speaker. I did very much enjoy her warmth, her wisdom. I like her as a person, but yeah, I struggled with this book.
Yeah, I think it would be good to wrap up by saying, like, overall, I think this book, I just wasn't the target audience, but I think it's a great intro to feminism. Um, I've heard a lot about her, and I thought I'd give her a shot, just like, other, like, people constantly talk about Judith Butler, so that's why I was like gonna read one of those. People constantly talk about Hooks. So um yeah, overall, I enjoyed the book. I liked critiquing it. I liked her mentions of socialism, class, race, and feminism. um yeah, overall, I got a little lost. I felt like it was too much, and I'm probably just too gay for Hooks at the end of the
That could have been my problem too. I just felt like she was trying to do too much, right? It was
Yeah.
like Dworkin is so refreshing because she just cuts to the chase. Like, and she's a great writer, and it's very clear what she's trying to accomplish, and she lays it all out in a really straightforward way. And I just felt like Hooks packed a lot into this short book, but and took some turns that I thought were strange. I did want to mention on that note, one of the things I found most bizarre about this entire book is she wrote 19 chapters on feminism and didn't talk about porn and prostitution. So I wanted to end on that note because you and I have been talking a little bit behind the scenes, and we want to do a talk specifically on that topic.
Yes, that is fascinating that you bring that up. She didn't mention it.
Nope. I thought that was a very strange omission.
Well, because who's the biggest supporter of porn and prostitution? Men. And who is she trying to reel in? Men.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think the target audience of this book may have been
Yeah.
men.
That's my takeaway too. This book is a book of feminism for men by talking about how women abuse their children. And so, yeah, she tried to make it inclusive and I think watered down the project of feminism. And
I I agree. I agree. Yeah, like if I would hand this to like your average Joe guy and be like, sure, this is what feminism is, bud. Just to like
yeah.
to be
Well,
on our
shout
side,
out to our
maybe.
feminists. If we talk about love, we don't criticize porn and we say that, women are violent too. All good. We're friends with men.
Okay.
Oh,
Yeah,
poor bell
yeah.
hooks.
Hopefully if any trans men read this, it reaches them maybe a little bit a deeper and it inspires them to dig deeper into feminism, hopefully.
Well, I look forward to having the conversation about porn and prostitution because I think it's an important one.
Absolutely. I look forward to that too. And thanks for chatting again.
It was great to see you again. Thanks for suggesting this book, even though we trashed it, but it's kind of fun to trash books too.
Yeah, that was fun. I think we covered a lot of good stuff today.
Yeah. All right. Take care of yourself. Have a good night.
All right, bye. Thank you.
Bye.